Summer at the US-Mexico border brought an unbearable heat, with the heavy air pressing down on everything, from the arid deserts to the overcrowded detention centers. Inside one facility in Texas, hundreds of unaccompanied migrant children waited for an uncertain future. These children, from countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, carried the weight of painful and dangerous journeys on their small shoulders. The detention areas were divided by cold metal fences. Some children tried to distract themselves, playing with a makeshift ball crafted from scraps of plastic, as if to forget their reality. Others sat huddled in the corners, their eyes hollow, occasionally glancing toward the doors as if waiting for a miracle. Among them was Miguel, a 9-year-old boy from Honduras. His frame was small, but his eyes held a maturity far beyond his years. Miguel once had a happy life in a small village nestled in the mountains, until the day his father was killed in a gang shootout. Fear gripped his mother and the rest of the villagers, forcing them to make an impossible choice: stay and risk death, or leave everything behind to search for safety. Miguel set out with his uncle on a packed truck, traveling along dusty, desolate roads and through jungles filled with unseen dangers. But their journey was cut short when his uncle was detained at a checkpoint. Left alone, with nothing but a small backpack containing a few personal belongings, Miguel continued on foot under the scorching sun, battling both fear and despair. Now, inside the detention center, Miguel sat curled up on a thin blanket spread across the cement floor. He quietly held onto a small notebook his uncle had given him, scribbling a few shaky lines in Spanish. "We've come so far, but is this really the place where we'll find peace?" He was just 9 years old, but the hardships he had endured were beyond anything most could imagine. And here, amidst the cold fences and weary eyes, Miguel clung to a fragile hope, a small hope that someone, somewhere, would listen to his story. It was an unbearably hot July afternoon, and the children's detention center at the Texas border was alive with activity. The sun blazed mercilessly overhead, its heat radiating off the walls and dusty grounds of the facility. Inside, staff members rushed back and forth, ensuring everything was in order. Every corner of the center was being scrutinized, every surface tidied, as local officials convened in hurried whispers, finalizing their talking points. Outside, media crews adjusted their cameras and microphones, waiting to capture the arrival of a highly anticipated guest, President Donald Trump. The sound of a helicopter slicing through the thick, humid air signaled his arrival. Dust and debris swirled as the rotors slowed, and moments later, President Trump emerged, his stride deliberate and confident. His familiar aura of authority was unmistakable as he surveyed the surroundings with a sharp, discerning gaze. Inside the facility, the president was greeted by local officials eager to present the numbers and reports they had meticulously prepared. The discussions began immediately, charts and figures laid out to emphasize the magnitude of the border crisis. They spoke of the growing influx of migrants, the strain on resources, and the escalating need for the border wall, a central piece of the president's immigration policy. Trump listened, nodding occasionally, but his attention seemed to shift as the tour progressed. The political tension in the air began to ease as his entourage moved toward a quieter section of the facility, the children's area. The room they entered was filled with rows of metal fences and thin mats strewn across the floor. Small children sat in groups or huddled in corners, their movements subdued. Their clothes were plain, stained with the marks of long, arduous journeys. Some of their faces were streaked with dirt, their hair disheveled, but it was their eyes that caught his attention. Quiet, wide, and unblinking, the children stared at the president with a mixture of emotions: curiosity, fear, and the faintest glimmer of hope, though they could not yet name it. As President Trump stepped further into the room, his presence seemed to cast a long shadow, both figuratively and literally. He stopped in the center and turned slowly, letting his gaze travel across the room. For a moment, the chatter of officials faded into the background. These weren't numbers on a report. He realized these were children, real children, each with a story etched into their tired faces. Each one had been on a journey most adults would struggle to survive. And now, here they were, confined within metal barriers, their futures hanging in the balance. Among the children stood Miguel, a boy no older than 9, with a lean frame and sun-darkened skin. He stood near the front of the group, clutching a small, tattered notebook tightly to his chest. It was the only possession he had carried through the grueling trek from Honduras, and it had become his anchor during the chaos. Miguel's heart raced as he watched the president. His small hands gripped the notebook even tighter, his knuckles turning white. This wasn't just an ordinary moment. It was the moment. Miguel had spent days, maybe even weeks, imagining what he would say if someone, anyone, would truly listen to him. And now, standing before one of the most powerful men in the world, he realized this was his chance. President Trump stood in the center of the room, his imposing presence commanding the attention of every child in the crowd. His sharp gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of the children, so small, so quiet, yet filled with emotions that seemed far too heavy for their young shoulders to bear. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the muffled shuffling of feet on the concrete floor. He took a step forward, his polished shoes clicking softly against the ground, and then he spoke. His voice was deep and steady, carrying an authoritative yet unexpectedly warm tone. I know you've all been through things no one should ever have to endure, but I want to hear from you. Tell me, what weighs on your hearts the most? Who wants to share something with me? I'm here to listen. The words hung in the air, filling the room with an even deeper silence. A heavy stillness settled over the children as they exchanged nervous glances. Some fidgeted with their hands. Others stared down at the ground, their tiny shoulders hunched as though weighed down by invisible burdens. There was hesitation in their eyes, a flicker of fear born from lives spent running, hiding, and surviving. For a moment, it seemed as though no one would speak. Then, from the front of the group, a boy with thin arms and sun-darkened skin slowly stepped forward. All eyes turned to him. It was Miguel. His steps were small, tentative, as if testing the ground beneath him. In his hands, he clutched a tattered notebook, its edges frayed from being handled too often. To Miguel, this notebook was more than just paper and ink. It was a piece of home, a reminder of the uncle who had once stood beside him on this long, painful journey. Miguel stopped a few feet in front of the president, his small frame dwarfed by the man towering over him. He gripped the notebook tightly, his knuckles turning white, as if drawing strength from it. Slowly, he lifted his head, revealing a pair of bright, white eyes. They weren't just the eyes of a child. They carried the weight of everything he had seen, everything he had lost. Pain, hope, and a quiet courage burned within them. Miguel took a shaky breath, the kind that comes from summoning every ounce of bravery within you. His voice, when it came, was soft, trembling, but steady enough to carry the weight of his words. "Mr. President," he began, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on Trump. "Do you think God will bring peace to us? Because of war, violence, and poverty, we had to leave our homes. But we don't know how long we'll have to keep running, or if there will ever be a day when we can stop." The question wasn't shouted or forced. It was spoken simply, almost quietly, but it carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. It wasn't just a question. It was a plea. It was a cry for help. The air in the room shifted. Miguel's words echoed softly in the silence, but their impact was deafening. Officials standing nearby froze, their hurried whispers forgotten. Staff members glanced at one another, their expressions betraying the emotions they tried to hide. Even the members of the media, cameras poised and ready, lowered their equipment momentarily, struck by the raw sincerity of the boy's question. President Trump, known for his sharp wit and decisive demeanor, stood still. His eyes, usually so commanding, softened as they met Miguel's. For a moment, the president said nothing. His expression changed, his lips parted slightly, his brow furrowed, and his usually unshakable posture seemed to ease. This wasn't just a question from a single child. It was the voice of countless others, millions of children and families forced to leave behind everything they knew, their lives shattered by war, violence, and despair. Miguel's question had cut through the walls of political rhetoric and hit straight at the heart of what it meant to be human. Miguel didn't look away. His small face, still streaked with dirt from the journey, held an expression that was both vulnerable and resolute. He wasn't just asking a question of a world leader. He was asking it of a man who held immense power, a man who, in this moment, was not just the President of the United States, but someone who could offer hope or turn away. The room felt heavy with expectation as the President stood there, his expression thoughtful, his hands clasped lightly in front of him. He seemed to be carefully weighing every word he might say, aware that his answer would carry far more weight than he had anticipated when he first walked into the room. Miguel remained still, his trembling hands still clutching the notebook, as though holding on to the last remnants of a life he hoped could one day be rebuilt. His question lingered, not just in the room, but in the hearts of everyone present. And in that moment, Miguel's small voice carried a power that even the strongest speeches or reports could never achieve. President Trump stood motionless for a moment, his sharp gaze softening as he looked at Miguel. The boy's small frame, his sun-darkened skin, and the tattered notebook clutched tightly in his hands seemed to tell a story far more powerful than any statistic or report he'd been shown earlier that day. There was something about Miguel, his quiet determination, the way he held his ground despite the fear in his eyes, that struck the president in a way few things had before. After a pause, Trump took a deliberate step forward and knelt down to meet Miguel at eye level. The room seemed to hold its breath as he placed a hand on Miguel's thin shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that immediately softened the tense atmosphere. Trump's voice, typically commanding and authoritative, took on a gentler, more thoughtful tone, as though he was speaking not just to Miguel, but to every child in the room. "Miguel," he began, his words deliberate and steady, "your question is an important one, not just for me, but for the whole world. You know, God always listens. He never turns away from those who pray to Him with all their hearts. But peace, Miguel, isn't something that just falls from the sky. It's not a miracle we wait for. It's something we, all of us, must work together to create." He paused, letting the words settle in the stillness of the room. His eyes met Miguel's, not with the sharpness of a leader addressing a crowd, but with the sincerity of one human being speaking to another. It was as if, in that moment, the walls separating their lives, powerful president and displaced child, had dissolved, leaving only two people connected by a shared understanding of the enormity of the question. "You've been through so much pain," he continued, his voice quieter but no less resolute. "More than any child should ever have to endure. But God has given you something truly precious, courage. Miguel, the fact that you're standing here today, asking this question, shows a strength that many adults wouldn't have. And that courage, that strength, is what reminds me of my responsibility." He paused again, his hand still resting on Miguel's shoulder. He shifted slightly, leaning in just enough to ensure the boy could see the sincerity in his expression. It reminds me of the responsibility that people like me, leaders, adults, people with the power to act, have to children like you. It's our job to make sure you and others like you can live safely, to make sure you can go home one day without fear. Trump's voice grew firmer, his tone carrying a weight of determination that filled the room. I can't change the world overnight, Miguel, but I promise you this. I will do everything in my power to help create a better future for you and for all the children here. Because you deserve to live in a world of peace. You deserve a chance to dream, to hope, and to live without fear. Miguel looked up at him, his dark eyes shimmering with emotion. For a moment, the harsh realities of his life, the endless running, the uncertainty of tomorrow seemed to fade, replaced by the rare warmth of being seen and heard. The president's words weren't just a promise. They were a rare glimmer of light in the midst of Miguel's dark and uncertain journey. The room was filled with a quiet, heavy emotion. It was the kind of silence that comes when words are too powerful to follow. You could hear the faint rustle of fabric as some officials shifted uncomfortably, bowing their heads, as if Miguel's question had reached into a part of them they hadn't expected to confront. Even the ever-present hum of the media's cameras seemed muted, the usual clicking of shutters stilled for this one profound moment. President Trump straightened slowly, his hand leaving Miguel's shoulder, but his gaze remained fixed on the boy. He looked at him for a beat longer, as though committing the boy's face and his words to memory. Then, turning to address the room, his voice rang out with conviction, steady and clear. "This boy," he said, gesturing to Miguel, "reminds us all that peace is not just a dream. It's a responsibility. It's something we owe to children like him. And it starts with us. It starts with never turning our backs on those who need us the most." The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. His response wasn't just for Miguel. It was for the officials who had briefed him, for the cameras capturing every moment, for the world beyond those walls. It was a declaration, a call to action, and a reminder of what it means to lead not just with power, but with humanity. Miguel remained standing where he was, clutching his notebook tightly to his chest, as if holding on to the hope that had just been offered to him. In that moment, the connection between the small boy and the powerful man before him seemed to transcend the boundaries of their vastly different lives. And for everyone who witnessed it, this exchange was more than a conversation. It was a moment that would linger, a memory that would not soon fade. Miguel's heartfelt question, asked with trembling hands but unwavering courage, and President Trump's unexpectedly compassionate response quickly captured the attention of the world. The video of the exchange spread like wildfire across social media and news platforms, drawing millions of views within hours. For many, it wasn't just another political headline. It was a moment of humanity breaking through the often cold and calculated world of policy. The simplicity of Miguel's words, paired with the gravity of his situation, resonated deeply. People across the globe saw not just a small boy, but a reflection of every child caught in the crossfire of conflict, poverty, and migration. His question, so innocent yet profound, became a rallying cry. What can we do to create a world where children like Miguel don't have to leave their homes? Initially, the event had been framed as part of President Trump's ongoing efforts to emphasize the importance of border security and highlight the challenges posed by illegal immigration. Officials had prepared meticulously to discuss statistics and policy, focusing on the need for stricter enforcement and infrastructure like the border wall. But Miguel's quiet courage shifted the narrative in a way no one had anticipated. During a press conference following the visit, President Trump addressed the moment directly. His tone, uncharacteristically reflective, carried the weight of what he had witnessed. Miguel's question wasn't just for me, it was a question for all of us. How do we create a world where children like him don't have to leave their homes? I made a promise to Miguel, and I make the same promise to America. We will not only protect our borders, but we will also protect the futures of these children. Those words, simple yet powerful, sparked a chain reaction. For the first time, the discussion surrounding immigration policies and border security expanded beyond enforcement to include humanity. From that moment, a series of commitments and initiatives began to take shape. The administration announced plans to improve the conditions in detention centers housing migrant children, places that had long been criticized for their harsh environments. These plans included increasing access to medical care, ensuring educational opportunities, and providing psychological support for children who had experienced trauma, recognizing that treating symptoms alone wasn't enough. The administration also began promoting international efforts to address the root causes of migration, violence, poverty, and economic instability in the children's home countries. But the ripple effect of Miguel's story extended far beyond policy. It inspired a surge of empathy and action within the global community. Humanitarian organizations reported record-breaking donations, as people from all walks of life sought to contribute in any way they could. Discussions about the treatment of migrant children took center stage in forums around the world, with leaders pledging to do more to address the crisis. The moment was soon dubbed by the media as the Miguel Awakening, a reminder that politics and humanity are not mutually exclusive but must work hand in hand. Miguel himself, once just one among many anonymous children in a detention center, became a symbol of hope. His face, captured in countless photos and videos, came to represent resilience in the face of adversity. In a later interview, speaking with a mix of nervousness and quiet confidence, Miguel reflected on the moment that changed his life. "I don't know if the world will change overnight, but I believe that if we speak the truth and ask the right questions, someone will listen." Miguel's question, and President Trump's willingness to pause, listen, and respond, became a testament to the power of even the smallest voices. It proved that monumental change doesn't always begin with grand speeches or sweeping legislation. Sometimes, it starts with a single, honest question from a child. For Miguel, it was more than just a conversation. It was a spark of light in a journey filled with darkness. And for the world, it was a reminder that behind every statistic is a story, and behind every story is a chance to do better. As the meeting ended, Miguel stepped out of the detention center, his small feet sinking slightly into the dusty, sun-baked ground. The late afternoon sun, golden and unwavering, bathed the world in warmth, a stark contrast to the cold uncertainty he had carried with him for so long. The harsh heat of the day seemed softer now, almost comforting, as if the weight of his burdens had eased, if only a little. Miguel's mind raced with thoughts, replaying the president's words over and over. They didn't promise immediate change. Miguel was too familiar with the slow march of time to expect that. But what they did offer was something far more personal, far more profound: acknowledgement. For the first time since his journey began, Miguel felt seen. He wasn't just another nameless child in the sea of despair that surrounded him. His voice had been heard. As he walked across the yard, Miguel glanced down at the small notebook he clutched tightly in his hands. Its edges were worn, its pages slightly crumpled, but to Miguel, it was priceless. The notebook was the last gift from his uncle before they were separated at the border, a tiny piece of home that had become his anchor in the chaos. He paused under the shade of a tree, the thin branches offering a momentary reprieve from the blazing sun. Gently, he opened the notebook, flipping past pages filled with hurried sketches and scrawled words that told pieces of his story. He stared at the blank page before him, the whiteness almost blinding in the sunlight. Slowly, he pulled out a pen and let it hover above the page. Miguel took a deep breath. His small hand trembled slightly, but he was determined. He began to write, the words spilling out from his heart onto the page. His first line was simple, yet filled with a wisdom beyond his years. God doesn't do everything on his own. He sends hope through the actions of people, and each of us can be his hands. He paused, reading the words again. They felt right, like they had been waiting inside him all along, just waiting for the right moment to be released. Miguel smiled faintly, his lips curving upward for what felt like the first time in months. The pen moved again, gliding across the page. This time, he wrote about more than just the hardships he had endured. He wrote about the dreams he carried in his heart, dreams of a world where no child would have to run, where families wouldn't have to leave their homes in search of safety, where every child could live in peace and freedom. He dreamed of growing up to help others, just as someone had taken the time to listen to him today. For Miguel, writing wasn't just a way to express himself. It was an act of reclaiming something that had been taken from him, hope. And though he couldn't predict what lay ahead, he knew that hope was no longer something distant and unreachable. It was alive, rooted deep in his heart, and growing stronger with every word he wrote. As he finished the page, Miguel looked up, squinting against the golden rays of the setting sun. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, a vast expanse that mirrored the uncertainty of his future. Yet for the first time, it didn't feel as daunting. There was a light now, faint but steady, guiding him forward. Miguel's story was no longer just his own. It had touched the hearts of many, spreading far beyond the walls of the detention center. His question, simple yet profound, had reminded people of something they often forgot, that even the smallest voices carry immense power. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, that light of hope continued to shine, not just in Miguel's heart, but in the hearts of all who had heard his story. Miguel's story is not just a fleeting, emotional moment captured in a detention center at the US-Mexico border. It is a profound testament to the power of faith, courage, and resilience, qualities that can shine even in the smallest, quietest voices. Behind the cold walls of the detention center, surrounded by the lingering shadows of despair and uncertainty, Miguel did something extraordinary. He didn't complain, didn't blame, but instead asked a question that transcended his circumstances. A question that struck at the very heart of humanity. Does peace truly exist? This was not merely the innocent inquiry of a single child. It was a cry from millions of nameless, faceless people around the world, those who have been forced to flee their homes, abandon their dreams, and endure unimaginable pain because of war, poverty, and violence. Miguel's words carried their hopes, their fears, and their yearning for a world where children no longer have to run, where families no longer have to leave everything behind in search of safety. What made Miguel's question so powerful was its simplicity. It didn't demand elaborate answers or immediate solutions. Instead, it asked something far more fundamental. What are we, as a society, doing to ensure that no child has to grow up in fear? How can we, as human beings, create a world where peace is not just an ideal, but a reality? Miguel's courage stood in stark contrast to the harshness of the world around him. He proved that even in the most trying circumstances, a child's voice can become a beacon of light, surrounded by walls meant to contain. His words broke through barriers, reminding everyone who heard them of the core values that unite us all: love, peace, and justice. For those who witnessed the exchange, Miguel's question wasn't just thought-provoking, it was transformative. It was a stark reminder that behind every statistic and policy decision are real lives, children with dreams, families with hopes, and people with stories worth hearing. The heartfelt response from the president, in turn, showed that leadership isn't just about power, it's about listening, about responding to the quiet voices that often go unheard. The impact of Miguel's story didn't stop at the walls of the detention center. It rippled outward, carried by the media and the hearts of those who listened. Across the world, people were reminded that hope is never a futile endeavor, that even when the odds seem insurmountable, even when policies feel unyielding, the smallest voices can spark the greatest changes. Miguel's story is a testament to the fact that change doesn't always come from grand gestures or sweeping movements. Sometimes, it starts with a single question, a sincere, honest question asked by a child who dared to believe that someone might listen. It's a reminder to us all that even the smallest, most fragile voices have the power to move the strongest hearts and inspire action in ways we might never expect.